Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gulf of Mexico Regional Collaboration Gulf Forum webinar for October. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I really appreciate it. Hang on, I am having a little bit of technical difficulties pulling up my info sheet for the day. So we'll just do it. Anyway, again, welcome to the Gulf of Mexico Forum webinar today. I really appreciate everyone joining. Audio is available either through the webinar computer interface or the webinar provided phone line. If you are joining audio by phone, please remember to enter your audio PIN to enable audio controls. So with that, a few housekeeping notes. First off, where is that audio PIN that I mentioned? So if you haven't entered it yet, if you look at the GoToWebinar drop-down menu on your screen, under audio, there should be a list with the phone number that you dialed and the audio PIN. If you've already entered your audio PIN and you're not quite sure if you have or not, it won't show up there. So you're good if you don't see one there, and if you haven't entered your PIN yet, it will be there. Few notes as we get going. We are recording today's presentation, so please don't share any personal or business identifiable information. Participants will be joined in mute status. And except for presenters, please leave your webcam off. It allows us to focus better on the presenters and their presentation and what they're talking about. I'll be monitoring the questions and chat box for written questions to share during the question and answer session. Also, to keep things simple today, we're sticking with written questions only, so it's easier to come back to it at the end. Erin and Blair will both be going through their slides, and then we'll have the questions after they're both done speaking. So please do enter questions into the Q&A box that you have in your GoToWebinar dropdown. And please also, if you would, include the speaker's name so we can direct it properly. So today's topic is marine mammal stranding and impacts from extreme weather and climate. Erin, I am going to turn the presenter view over to you while I introduce both of you. All right. And Erin, I have just made you the presenter.
Thank you. I'm sharing my first slide.
Yes, I am seeing it. So let me introduce you two real quick. So first off, Erin Fougères will be our first presenter. She is a marine mammal biologist and the NOAA Fisheries Marine Mammal Stranding Program Administrator for the Southeast United States. She earned her undergraduate degree from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and her master's and PhD in marine biology from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where she worked in the Marine Mammal Stranding Program for more than 10 years. Erin's research expertise is in the physiological ecology with an emphasis on bottlenose dolphin thermoregulation and morphology. As the Stranding Program Administrator for NOAA since 2008, she oversees a network of volunteer organizations responding to marine mammal strandings from North Carolina through Texas, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Erin helps to coordinate the response to and oversee the investigation of marine mammal strandings, including mass strandings and unusual mortality events. Also, to introduce Blair Mase. Blair has served in the position of NOAA's Southeast Region Marine Mammal Stranding Coordinator since the onset of the program in 1993. Erin is based out of the Southeast Regional Fisheries Science Center Marine Lab, and she has extensive experience in the responses of marine mammal stranding events, out-of-habitat rescues, disentanglement, as well as unusual mortality events and investigations. Blair works very closely with Erin Fougères at the Southeast Regional Office. So welcome to you both, Erin and Blair, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kristen. And I would like to start off by thanking all the people who've been involved in responding to and investigating the strandings that I'll be discussing today, and also all the colleagues who've kindly shared their slides and analyses with me. So I'm happy to be presenting today on their behalf. So today I'd like to start with an overview of the Marine Mammal Stranding Network and unusual mortality events. And I'll also discuss low salinity as an emerging issue for bottlenose dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico and the 2019 Northern Gulf bottlenose dolphin unusual mortality event. In the United States, all marine mammals are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, And the act consists of 5 parts or titles, but I'll be focusing primarily on Title 4 for my talk today. Title 4 was established with the 1992 amendments to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and it established the Marine Mammal Health and Stranding Response Program. The National Marine Fisheries Service was designated as the lead agency to coordinate related activities for the whales, dolphins, and porpoises, and seals and sea lions. And the activities include to collect and disseminate data on health and health trends, to correlate health trends data with biological, physical, and chemical environmental parameters, and to coordinate effective responses to unusual mortality and morbidity events. There's many components to the Marine Mammal Health and Stranding Response Program, including the Stranding Network and its associated rehabilitation and release activities, the Disentanglement Network, unusual mortality event investigations, biomonitoring and health assessments. There's a Prescott Grant Program. We do tissue bank and quality assurance, and there's data management. But the two that are most relevant for today's discussion are the Stranding Network and unusual mortality event investigations. Volunteer marine mammal stranding networks exist throughout all coastal states to respond to marine mammal strandings. And nationwide, there are more than 100 organizations in the Stranding Network, including nonprofits, aquaria, universities, and government agencies, among others. Cumulatively, they respond to more than 5,000 marine mammal strandings per year. So what exactly is a stranding? And it's not a whale on a beach in a Speedo, although we haven't had an entangled dolphin in a Speedo before. But it is sick, injured, or dead marine mammals found on or along the shore, or entrapped or disoriented marine mammals that are unable to return to their natural habitat without assistance. There are several types of strandings, including single strandings, which is the most common, mom-calf pair strandings, where the mom is sick or disabled and the dependent calf follows her into shore. And there are mass strandings, such as large-scale pilot whale events that you may have heard about in the news. Mass strandings are 2 or more animals that simultaneously strand and are not a mom-calf pair. So in the Southeast region, which is defined as North Carolina through Texas and includes Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, there were a total of 12,149 strandings over the past 15 years, with an average of about 810 strandings per year. And of those, 13% live strand. Most of the strandings in our region occur in Florida, which is shown here in kind of the mustard yellow, North Carolina in red, and Texas, which is sort of that brown wedge at the top. However, for today's talk, I'll focus on strandings that occur along the US coast of the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf Stranding Network includes 16 member organizations with 6 facilities authorized to rehabilitate stranded marine mammals. This includes 2 rehabilitation facilities in Florida, 1 in Mississippi, 1 in Louisiana, and 2 rehabilitation facilities in Texas. From 2008 through 2022, there were almost 6,000 strandings in the Gulf. And this figure shows the number of strandings by state over time. The Gulf Coast of Florida is in blue, Alabama is in yellow, Mississippi in pink, Louisiana in green, and Texas in red. Bottlenose dolphins are the most common dead stranding in the Southeast US and in the Gulf of Mexico, making up 85% of all strandings. And this is likely due to the fact that they live in coastal habitats where they're more likely to wash onto shore when they die, as opposed to pelagic animals that might die further out at sea. And they also less commonly live strand unless they're offshore animals, likely because they're more familiar with navigating the shallow coastal areas they inhabit. Other commonly stranded animals include Sinella species, the pygmy and dwarf sperm whales, or Kogia, which most commonly live strand, melon-headed whales, and sperm whales. We also regularly get mass strandings of short-fin pilot whales along the west coast of Florida, and in 2017, we had a mass stranding of 100 false killer whales in Everglades National Park. Now I'd like to talk briefly about unusual mortality events and our process for these investigations. An unusual mortality event is defined under the Marine Mammal Protection Act as a stranding that is unexpected, involves a significant die-off of any marine mammal population, and demands an immediate response. There are 7 criteria used to determine whether a mortality event is unusual, including higher than expected numbers of stranded marine mammals, a temporal, spatial, or demographic shift in strandings, similar or unusual clinical or pathologic findings, and mortality in a vulnerable or declining population. For the purposes of our investigations, higher than expected is generally considered to be more than 2 standard deviations above the average stranding rate. When we start to see an increase in or unusual patterns of strandings, we consult with a federally appointed Working Group for Marine Mammal Unusual Mortality Events, which is a congressionally mandated panel of marine mammal health experts with expertise in biology, toxicology, pathology, ecology, and epidemiology. The working group's primary role is to determine when an unusual mortality event is occurring and to help direct the response and the investigation. Once a UME is declared, on-site and off-site coordinators are designated to liaise with the working group and help lead the investigation. The coordinators also work to establish investigative teams to investigate the cause or contributing factors to the UME and to develop a work plan for review and approval by the working group for funding under the UME Contingency Fund. So this is a generic overview of the UME investigative process, which is modified depending on the specific situation. It is an iterative process, ruling in or out potential contributing factors. First-tier testing typically tests for common or apparent causes of UMEs and evaluates the histopathology to look for common causes of mortality. Much of the testing that can be conducted is dictated by the state of decomposition of the animals that are stranding, and many times the causes of UMEs are never determined. From 1991 to the present, there have been 72 formally recognized UMEs in the US. UMEs are fairly evenly split across coasts, with about a third occurring on either the Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, or Pacific coasts. The causes of most UMEs are frequently undetermined. However, for those UMEs where the cause can be identified, biotoxins, shown here in red, such as red tide or domoic acid, followed by infectious disease, shown in blue, and ecological factors, shown in green, are most commonly found. Cetaceans, the whales, dolphins, and porpoises, shown in blue, are the species most often impacted by unusual mortality events, followed by pinnipeds, which are the seals and sea lions, in red, and manatees, in green. So now I'd like to discuss low salinity as an emerging issue for bottlenose dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico. Bottlenose dolphins are the most common stranding in the Gulf of Mexico. They're found throughout the world in both temperate and tropical offshore and coastal waters, including harbors, bays, gulfs, and estuaries. There are 2 distinct ecotypes of bottlenose dolphins, the coastal and offshore, and they differ in their physiology, morphology, and ecology. Bottlenose dolphins are long-lived, with a lifespan of 40 to 45 years for males and more than 50 years for females. In the US Gulf of Mexico, there is a combination of offshore, continental shelf, and coastal bottlenose dolphin stocks, as well as resident stocks in some embayments and estuaries. In total, there are 37 separate stocks: the offshore stock, continental shelf stock, 3 coastal stocks, and 32 bay, sound, or estuarine stocks of bottlenose dolphins. Bottlenose dolphin estuarine stocks are particularly vulnerable to threats posed by changes in salinity because they are resident to a defined region and habitat. They exhibit strong, lifelong site fidelity to a small and typically well-defined home range, regardless of environmental challenges that negatively impact their health. Coastal and oceanic bottlenose dolphins are typically found in salinity ranging from 20 to 35 parts per thousand. However, dolphins in bays, sounds, and estuaries across the US periodically experience lower salinity environments, especially in the spring or early summer. In some extreme weather years, those lower salinity environments may be very low and last for longer periods of time. How low the salinity goes and how long it lasts often determines the severity of the impacts to dolphins. Health impacts such as skin lesions, abnormal blood chemistry, swelling of the cornea, severe secondary infections, and eventual death can occur in dolphins due to low salinity exposure over a period of days to weeks. These health impacts can be exacerbated in dolphins with pre-existing conditions, such as injuries, infections, poor nutrition, or immune suppression. Freshwater skin lesions on dolphins are a distinct ulcerative dermatitis, which is characterized by patchy skin pallor that progresses to variable circular or targetoid, often raised, and centrally ulcerated lesions covering the body surface. Histologically, or when the skin is examined under a microscope, the freshwater lesions consist of hydropic degeneration of the epidermis. And hydropic degeneration is a term used to express the swelling that occurs in injured cells caused by an influx of water. This hydropic degeneration results in ulceration and necrosis. The lesions and ulcerations that develop due to damage and death of epidermal cells can provide an entry point for secondary infection of the epidermis and underlying deeper tissues, the dermis. The affected skin is often colonized by a variety of opportunistic fungal, bacterial, and algal species, forming mats that give it a variable yellow, green, or orange discoloration. And on this slide, you can see skin lesions that range from mild, such as pale skin, that pallor that I was talking about, to moderate lesions with some algal mats, to more severe lesions where the animal is almost completely covered. To help evaluate freshwater impacts, NOAA and our partners have developed a draft conceptual model shown here. Dolphins can be exposed to freshwater either through ingestion when they consume their prey or through direct external contact. The freshwater can then alter the gut and skin lining and microbiome, resulting in osmotic imbalance, water overload, and increased exposure or infection with pathogens. The health outcomes can range from mild to severe. I previously discussed changes to the skin from freshwater exposure, but other pathologies include changes to the blood chemistry, alterations in hormones, secondary infections leading to toxemia and septicemia, and cerebral edema. The time from initial exposure to low salinity to death in dolphins is not fully understood and may depend on the amount of salinity change, how low, the length of exposure, how rapidly the salinity changes, whether exposure is continuous or intermittent, and the presence of any underlying health conditions or additional stressors. To help better evaluate the time from initial exposure to low salinity to death in bottlenose dolphins, an expert elicitation was held in November 2019. The experts in the elicitation evaluated 3 hypothetical scenarios. The first was an extended low salinity event. For example, a bay, sound, or estuary environment that was flooded with fresh or low salinity water until it dropped below 5 parts per thousand for an extended period of time. This is an environment in which animals are also exposed to other significant stressors, such as noise or low quality prey or exposure to contaminants, and they're more likely to be in a compromised health state. The second scenario is very similar to scenario 1, but in an environment where there are a few other stressors, and animals in the population are broadly considered to be healthy. And the last was an acute salinity change event, where bottlenose dolphins experience a rapid change, such as over 0 to 5 days, in a salinity from a typical salinity environment, meaning 15 to 25 parts per thousand, down to an atypical environment, where the salinity would drop below 5 parts per thousand for an extended period. The first 2 scenarios were almost identical, with the difference being the initial health status of the animals. And the elicitation determined that the time to death was 62 days in animals exposed to other significant stressors and 77 days for animals in an environment with few other stressors. For instances where the change in salinity was much more acute, the experts considered that the time to death would be much quicker, and there would be a median time to death of 22 days of continuous exposure to low salinity water. Increasing freshwater exposure is an emerging issue of concern for dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico and throughout the Southeast, particularly because climate change can affect the intensity and frequency of precipitation. Extreme precipitation events have increased in frequency and intensity in the US and across many regions of the world since the 1950s. In the US, annual precipitation has increased at a rate of 0.2 inches per decade since 1901, with extreme precipitation events outpacing this trend. The Midwest and Northeast have experienced the strongest increases in heavy precipitation events. This map shows the observed on the top and projected on the bottom change in the amount of precipitation falling in the heaviest 1% of events. The numbers in black circles for the observed or the top maps show the percentage change and illustrate that most of the increase in heavy precipitation events since 1901 has occurred in the last 60 years. The projected amounts in the bottom maps show two climate change scenarios. The map on the left is based on a lower amount of greenhouse gas emissions, while the map on the right shows a higher concentration of emissions in that scenario. These increases in heavy precipitation, particularly in the northern Great Plains and Midwest, could have profound impacts on the Gulf of Mexico, given that those watersheds largely drain through the Mississippi River. There have already been health impacts observed in individual bottlenose dolphins due to local changes in heavy precipitation. In Galveston Bay, Texas, bottlenose dolphins are studied by the Galveston Bay Dolphin Research and Conservation Program. Since 2014, there have been numerous periods of low salinity in the bay due to heavy precipitation. These include 4 weeks of Texas rains in 2015 from a strengthening El Nino, the Tax Day flood in 2016, Hurricane Harvey in 2017, and low salinity due to extreme precipitation in 2019. This slide shows dolphins identified by the Galveston Bay Dolphin Research and Conservation Program and the changes to their skin condition over this time period. With low salinity, dolphins developed pallor, mottling, and lesions. One dolphin, number 209, developed one of the most severe cases of lesions and algal overgrowth that we've ever observed, and has subsequently never been seen again, and is presumed dead. Another dolphin, number 219, also developed pallor and moderate skin lesions and was found dead in February 2019. While we knew that freshwater exposure could have local impacts on individual dolphins, we had not previously observed a large-scale mortality event attributed to low salinity. However, May 2018 through April 2019 were the wettest 12 months in 124 years on record. The Bonnie Carey Spillway opened twice in the late winter and spring of 2019 for the first time in its history to prevent flooding in New Orleans, diverting floodwaters into Lake Pontchartrain in the northern Gulf. There was also significant discharge from the Pearl River in Mississippi and other spillways, diversions, and watersheds across the northern Gulf. This slide shows freshwater discharge in 2019 compared with the historical average for the Mississippi River, the Pascagoula River, Mobile Bay, and the Apalachicola River. Month is on the x-axis, and discharge in cubic meters per second is on the y-axis. The red lines represent discharge in 2019, while the thick black lines represent the historical mean water discharge. Freshwater discharge in 2019 was well above the historical average, particularly in the late winter and spring. Coincident with this increased freshwater discharge, from February 1st through November 30th, there was a 4-fold increase in stranded bottlenose dolphins along the coast of the northern Gulf of Mexico, from the eastern border of Taylor County, Florida, through Louisiana. Historically, in this region, from February to November, there are an average of 83 dolphin strandings reported. However, during 2019, this increased to 337 bottlenose dolphin strandings, the vast majority of which occurred from February through June. Although many carcasses were too decomposed to allow for necropsies or to evaluate for skin lesions, or in some cases, they weren't recovered for investigation. The animals the Marine Mammal Stranding Network were able to collect were examined for freshwater exposure, infectious diseases, biotoxin exposure, and fisheries interactions. Of the live, fresh dead, and moderately decomposed dolphins observed, 32% had visible skin lesions consistent with prolonged low salinity exposure. This mortality event was declared an unusual mortality event based on the marked increase in strandings and the similar pathologic findings found in the stranded dolphins. Dr. Lance Garrison from NOAA's Southeast Fisheries Science Center analyzed the strandings associated with this UME, the occurrence of freshwater lesions, and the salinity at the time of the strandings. In the next few slides, I'll walk through those analyses. The figures here show stranding numbers in different years or time periods, starting in 2002 through 2004 at the top, through 2019 at the bottom. Generally, in the Northern Gulf, there is an extended spring peak of strandings from February to April. The time period during and immediately after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010 and 2011 was characterized by high stranding rates throughout the year. But 2019 had very high stranding rates, even higher than those during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. The 2019 strandings also occurred later in the year than the normal peak of strandings in the spring. Although the unusual mortality event occurred from the panhandle of Florida through Louisiana, the majority of stranded dolphins were found in Mississippi and eastern Louisiana, as shown here in this heat map of strandings. So Lance looked at strandings in eastern Louisiana from Regali's Pass, shown in the top figure, moving east through Mississippi Sound. Overall, strandings occurred primarily in the central portion of Mississippi Sound. The increase in strandings started in mid-March, with the biggest peaks in May 2019. Increased strandings also generally started in the west and progressed with time towards the east. There was also a very high incidence of freshwater lesions noted in 2019 relative to previous years. Dolphins where freshwater lesions were observed are shown in blue, and if freshwater lesions were not observed, they are shown in red. It's worth noting that freshwater lesions may not have been regularly recorded by the stranding network in earlier years, and many animals are too decomposed to identify lesions or may not have been recovered. The typical spring peak of strandings is dominated by smaller animals or calves shown in blue. However, in 2019, there was a slightly higher stranding rate of calves compared to previous years, but there was also a very high stranding rate of older non-calf dolphins shown in greens and reds. These older non-calf dolphins were also the dolphins most commonly observed with freshwater skin lesions, as shown in the figure at the top. The top figure shows where freshwater lesions are noted, and the bottom graph is showing where no lesions were noted. Lance also looked at salinity as measured by USGS water quality monitoring stations in Mississippi Sound. He examined 7 stations or buoys, circled here, along a roughly east-west gradient in the main portion of the sound, with the stations circled in yellow being farther west and those in red farther east. The salinity in spring 2019 was substantially lower than the historical means at all the buoys examined. There were periods where the salinity was 10 to 15 PSU lower than the historical means at most stations. There was also a progression of low salinity moving from west to east, with salinity less than 5 practical salinity units, shown by the black dashed line, arriving later at more eastern stations. Interestingly, there was also a spike in salinity observed in July when Tropical Storm Barry moved through the Gulf. And you can see that spike. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's this spike right here, right after the day line at the bottom. These figures overlay the average salinity in each zone with the strandings observed in 2019, moving from the west, or zone 1 at the top, towards the east, zone 3 at the bottom, in eastern Louisiana and Mississippi. Zone 1 has relatively few strandings, but also has a relatively low abundance of dolphins in that area, as well as poor stranding network coverage in 2019. In Zone 2, there was a dramatic drop in salinity from 20 PSU to 1 PSU over a month from late February to late March. It remained continuously below 5 PSU until late June. This decrease in salinity coincided with increased dolphin strandings and increased strandings of dolphins with freshwater lesions. In Zone 3, there was an initial decline from 20 PSU to 4 PSU over those same months from late February to late March, but then salinity increased before slowly declining to 2 PSU in late May. This decrease to 2 PSU in late May also coincided with very high numbers of strandings and animals found with freshwater lesions. So in summary, extended low salinities observed in 2019 were followed by a four-fold increase in stranding rates in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle, and a high incidence of freshwater lesions on stranded dolphins. 68% of stranded dolphins in earlier stages of decomposition, those that were live, fresh dead, or moderately decomposed, didn't have skin lesions that were consistent with low salinity exposure. However, the impacts of prolonged low salinity exposure on dolphins aren't well understood, and not all exposed animals may develop skin lesions. The UME primarily involved an increase in stranded larger dolphins or non-calves, although there was a small increase in numbers of calves relative to recent years. The highest density of strandings occurred in the middle portion of Mississippi Sound, corresponding to likely the highest density of dolphins, and also dolphins that would not typically experience extended periods of low salinity. Other factors were tested in the UME. Brucella, a bacterial infection that affects dolphins, and reported fisheries interactions were at or below historical levels for the UME area. Additionally, all dolphins tested were negative for cetacean morbillivirus, which is a common cause of large-scale mortality events, and they were also negative for microcystin toxins or biotoxins. The UME it was determined was caused by low salinity waters from extreme freshwater discharge from watersheds that drain into the northern Gulf of Mexico. And now, let's see if I can make it advance. I'm going to turn it over to Blair Mase, my colleague
Erin.
at the Southeast Fisheries Science Center. Yep.
I think the data tables might not have shown. I think it froze on the map. Would you mind real quick before we switch it over to Blair, if you could go back to the two data tables? There we go. Thank you.
Sure, I'm so sorry about that. So this one is showing the time series of daily salinity from the west at the top towards the east at the bottom. And it's just showing that low salinity progressed from west to east and was significantly below that black dashed line of 5 PSU. And then this figure overlays that average salinity in each of those zones, moving from west at the top to east at the bottom with the stranding numbers. And freshwater lesions are noted in blue.
Thank you so much, Erin, and I'm sorry to interrupt during the transition there.
No worries, thank you. Sorry about that.
Oh, I'm sure it was a technical glitch or something. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, Blair?
Hang on, Blair, you're muted just a second. Okay, you should be all right again.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. All right, thank you, Erin. That was an excellent talk. Set the stage for my talk, which is a little bit shorter. I'm going to be giving a talk on hurricane impacts on marine mammals in the Gulf of Mexico, specifically talking about bottlenose dolphin. Next slide. So as you can see here, has definitely been an increase in the occurrence of hurricanes within the Gulf of Mexico basin. I broke this up into decades, and comparing 1982 to 1992, the very first decade, to 2013 to 2022, there's been over a twofold increase in hurricane occurrence in the Gulf. Next slide. And so the most significant impacts that we see on bottlenose dolphin in particular is displacement. Storm surge associated with hurricanes can cause marine mammals to become displaced, and they are actually pushed inshore. And as those storm waters recede, the dolphins are sometimes reported in areas where they are not typically observed. And what we call this is out of habitat. Low-lying areas in the northern Gulf of Mexico specifically are particularly vulnerable to coastal flooding from storms. And a lot of the out of habitat scenarios that we see are dolphins that are displaced in ponds, even golf course ponds and lakes, landlocked canals, levee systems, drainage ditches, flooded fields, and pastures. The photo on the right kind of shows basically a dolphin that was in a drainage ditch that somebody, a member of the public, identified with some spray paint. And actually, it was very useful that the sheriff's office saw this spray paint sign. They saw that there was, in fact, a dolphin in a drainage ditch. The water was receding, and our stranding network was able to get out there and rescue that dolphin, which was only in about a couple of inches of water prior to relocating it and releasing it back into the Gulf. So a lot of times these dolphins, they can be, like I mentioned, in these areas a couple of days, but they can also be up in these areas up to weeks or months until they're actually found or seen, especially in some of the remote areas in Louisiana and eastern Texas. Next slide. Other potential impacts include strong currents and rough seas that can separate pods of highly social marine mammals, such as Stenella species and pilot whales. We've had instances of strandings of both. The most recent being a mass stranding in Alabama and Dauphin Island of spotted dolphin that occurred. We can also see habitat shifts that occur with flooding events that push bay and estuarine dolphins out of their normal environment and further offshore. And then also intense storm conditions can lead to freshwater influx and water contamination, which includes, chemical and oil spills and sewage spills. And this can also lead to health issues, as Erin alluded to in her talk. Next slide. So looking at the total out of habitat dolphins from this time frame, 2010 to 2020, there was a total of 93 displaced dolphins in that time frame. And as you can see here, Louisiana is the winner with 46 animals. I was even surprised to see that number of animals that were displaced. But also during this time frame, it was Louisiana was impacted by numerous hurricanes, so it coincides with that. We also tend to see a lot in Texas as well. Okay, next slide. So some health impacts that can occur, as Erin mentioned, skin lesions, secondary infections, abnormal blood chemistry can result from freshwater exposure and low salinity. Also, contaminant toxicity can occur with poor water quality from chemical and oil spills, as well as biotoxins. Injury and trauma can occur from marine debris, such as metal scraps, trees, and limbs. They can puncture the animal as the waters are receding. And then emaciation and starvation from low or no prey availability. Sometimes these animals can end up in areas where they're not detected, they have low prey or no prey, and they're very malnourished by the time we do get to them, and sometimes we don't get to them in time, unfortunately. Next slide. Now, some of the challenges that that occur is actually getting access to the stranding site. When we get a report and we're trying to get to the animal to verify, a lot of times our primary stranding network groups are not able to get out there and verify because the roads are washed out, or they're closed, or the bridges are washed out or closed. So that's something that we have to contend with. Also, we want to be sensitive to the human impacts. A lot of these, especially the major storms, obviously have significant human impacts and even deaths that occur, and we want to be sensitive to that before we start trying to coordinate and get out to rescue those dolphins. And even our primary responders often get impacted as well, so that's something we have to consider. And then we have the media and public pressure. So a lot of times the media are the first ones out there after a hurricane. They want to assess the damage. They're looking out with their helicopters and on the beaches, and they are a lot of times the first people who actually report a stranded or out of habitat marine mammal. And a lot of times it's on live television. So there is that extra added pressure to respond. And sometimes they take matters into their own hands, and which can be very dangerous for both the humans and the animals if folks don't know what they're doing. So prior to hurricanes that are landing on shore, we try to do a media push, a social media push, to try to educate folks on who to call if they do in fact run into an out of habitat or stranded marine mammal after the storm. Also things that are challenges are gas stations a lot of times are empty or closed, and the availability of water, or even vessels, especially with our primary responders. They might not have access to their own equipment. So we do rely heavily on our outside partners from outside states, other states, to come in, provide gas, vehicles, and even vessels when we need to do a response effort. And another consideration is just the sheer destruction that occurs. Some of these animals might end up in an area where there's a significant water system, several acres of water, and the boat launches are washed away. So we have to get really creative on how we get in there, try to observe them and take photographs. Sometimes we'll just end up pushing longboats right off the side of the road or off the side of a bank and do what we can to try to get out there and assess the situation and the animal. Next slide. So as far as rescue and response goes, the rescues of these particular situations, as you can see, they do have their challenges, and they also require a very high level of coordination. A typical response effort in a water systems, like you would see above, would require about 20 to 40 personnel depending on the scenario, and requires significant planning. So we do rely heavily on our primary responders, the responders that are in charge of that particular geographic area, and they would go out and monitor. They'd scout the area to see what's going on, to see the scenario, what kind of damage we have to contend with, the condition of the dolphins, the condition of the area itself, the water depth. So these are all issues that are very important before we start sending out a crew from other states to come in and conduct a rescue effort to work together. We also like to measure the urgency. So, for example, if you have a dolphin that is in a drainage ditch and the water's receding and it will be high and dry in 24 to 48 hours, that type of response would be very different than if you had a dolphin in a pasture, flooded pasture, or a large lake that was full of fish and salt water. So that would give us a little bit more time to respond and to conduct a rescue effort. Next slide. Additional things that we always try to consider are human risk factors and animal risk factors. As I mentioned, some of these areas could have contaminated water and marine debris. We also have to deal with, especially in Louisiana and Texas and Alabama and Mississippi, actually, gators and snakes. We've had sometimes Fish and Wildlife Service officers are just there to monitor the gator situation while we have folks in the water with a net and dolphin. So these are issues we need to always consider. Also, equipment availability, as I mentioned, we really rely heavily on our out-of-state partners to assist with equipment, because sometimes the equipment just simply is not available depending on the type of damage and destruction that occurred from the storm. We do rely also on contracting companies that are doing the cleanup work who could potentially help with equipment as well. So that's kind of all part of the coordination aspect. Sometimes with high category storms, we can get tapped into the ICS system, the Wildlife Response Team. And with that, we would have access to military equipment, Coast Guard equipment, and the photos to the right. Both of these were in Texas from Hurricane Harvey. We had access to a Humvee. Inside that Humvee is a stranding team and a dolphin. We could not get access to a release site after the animal was rescued, and that Humvee provided the perfect vehicle to get through the water and get to the Gulf of Mexico to release a dolphin. And then that lower picture, same thing, Coast Guard was able to assist. We could not get access to a release site because of the roads washed out. So they flew our team and the dolphin to the beach, and we were able to release that dolphin from there. And then also to consider environmental factors when conducting a rescue and response effort. If there's more storms coming in, extreme heat, and even extreme cold in some cases that we have to contend with, because a lot of times these areas are very remote and we need to plan accordingly with the environmental and weather impacts. Next slide. So we do gain some information from animals that are out of habitat. We try any animal that is captured and relocated, we try to apply a tag to that animal. And that tag, it's a satellite tag, and it will help us determine release success. So if the tag is on after the animal's been released up to 90 days, that is considered a release. We also can look at basic home range and habitat usage from the bay and estuarine dolphins that we do relocate, which provides valuable management information to those stocks in the area. And as Erin mentioned, the impacts of salinity. And what's a little bit different in this scenario with an out of habitat case is that it's a little bit of its own controlled study. So we know exactly when the dolphins did become out of habitat. They may become into a pond or a lake for a particular storm, and we can measure the salinity there and monitor that animal closely before it gets relocated. And we can also monitor the impacts, the slow impacts that Erin mentioned, the pallor, the skin lesions, when they start to develop. And it just basically gives us a better understanding about how long it takes for that exposure to start to take effect on these dolphins. Next slide. Okay, so I have a video here, and I am going to try to show it because from my screen.
Blair, I'm going to make you the presenter now so you can do that.
Okay. Woo. Okay. Sorry.
We were trying it before the webinar and we couldn't get the audio to work. So we're pulling up the actual recording.
Okay, let's see. Can you hear it?
Yes.
Can you see it?
After Hurricane Laura, we received reports of displaced marine mammals that are out of habitat, presumed to be from the storm surge from Hurricane Laura. On September 9th, we rescued a bottlenose dolphin that was reported to us. She was in a deep pond on the side of the road with no access to open water. Members from the Marine Mammal Stranding Network, from Audubon Coastal Wildlife Network, and the Texas Marine Mammal Stranding Network were able to successfully catch, transport, and release this animal back into the Gulf of Mexico at Rutherford Beach. We were able to watch her swim off. She was tagged with an identifier tag so we could be able to spot her. And it's a great feeling. We believe she was a strong, capable animal and that she belongs back there. We truly rely on the public. They're the eyes and ears for this stranding network. We see with hurricanes, especially stronger hurricanes, a lot of times the storm surge and the coastal flooding, these animals will get into areas they're typically not in. The Coastal Wildlife Network is now the primary stranding network for marine mammals and sea turtles in Louisiana. So we ask if you see a live or dead marine mammal or sea turtle to please call us at 504-235-3005. That is a 24-hour hotline that is dedicated to marine mammal and sea turtle strandings.
Okay, Erin, can you
Yeah,
reset.
Kristen, do you want to throw it back to me and I'll put up the last slide? Great. Let's see.
Okay, so that was one of our very valued partners in Louisiana. Obviously, they've been busy with a lot of hurricane response efforts for distressed or displaced dolphins. And that number that they posted is perfect number to call in Louisiana, but I also wanted to post our 877 whale help number that will get you to the right primary responders, no matter what state you're calling from in the Southeast. And then I also wanted to acknowledge our valued stranding network partners that participate in these displaced response and rescue efforts. And then I guess we can hand it over to questions that anybody might have.
Erin and Blair, thank you so much. Those were two really impressive and interesting presentations. We have a lot of questions coming in the question box. And again, everyone, please do, if you have a question, enter it into the question box and we'll read it out. And if we don't get to you, I'll make sure that Erin and Blair get the questions for later on. Let's see. Popping out the question box. All right, Erin, this one is for you. One of the questions was, have freshwater impacts always been seen in the Gulf, or is it a new threat, or is it just exacerbated by increased anthropogenic pressure?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say we often get animals in the spring when there is a lot of runoff and rain. We do tend to get animals. We get freshwater impacts from dolphins often that go up like rivers or canals, and that's really I think where we first noticed it. But we do occasionally we'll get animals, in the spring, but it's definitely increasing in frequency. Particularly with that large scale mortality event that we had in 2019. We'd never had a die-off that was entirely attributed to freshwater exposure that we were aware of. And there had been a couple of other die-offs where freshwater had been associated with it. In 2010, at the beginning of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, there was an unusual mortality event, and there was a population of dolphins in Lake Pontchartrain that we had been monitoring for an extended period of time that we think actually came in and were out of habitat from Katrina and never left from Hurricane Katrina. And a lot of those animals died at the beginning of 2010 when it was a very low salinity year in the lake. And then that unusual mortality event sort of extended out and became the Deepwater Horizon oil spill event, which happened sort of right after that. And then we did have another event in Matagorda in 1992, but that was also associated with morbillivirus and contaminants and stuff. So that freshwater event that happened in 2019 was really unique for us.
Interesting. Thank you, Erin. And kind of a corollary question for you. With the lack of onshore freshwater, so for example, the increasing salt wedge in the Mississippi River at the moment, how is this affecting dolphins with increased salinity in estuaries?
So I don't think we haven't seen any impacts from increased salinity. I don't think that the higher salinities bother them. It's those extended periods. They're adapted for 20 to 35 parts per thousand. So it's those extended periods of low salinity where their skin takes on their osmotic balance gets kind of messed up, and their skin sort of swells from the cells taking on extra water, and they develop those lesions, and they can develop blood chemistry abnormalities. That's really the problem for us. So the salt wedge is good for them. That's all good. It might end up bringing dolphins farther up into areas where they wouldn't normally be found. So if that shifts quickly, we could start to see low salinity impacts if that salt wedge disappears. But so it might bring animals into an area where they wouldn't normally be found, but the salinity of the salt wedge I wouldn't think would be an issue.
Just a quick question I had. Those pictures were so sad and impressive in a just poor thing's way, but do they heal? How long does it take for them to heal if they get back into the proper salinity?
Yeah, that's another great question. We don't know how long it takes, and that's a big question. And we don't know what those sort of intermittent exposures, like that slide I showed you in Texas, where they had years where it would be low salinity and they would recover, and then it'd be low again. And then for a couple of those animals, they ultimately ended up succumbing and dying. So we don't know what those sort of intermittent exposures have. We do know that their skin can heal. Dolphins that are rescued in low salinity, like Blair's out of habitat animals that you mentioned, their skin recovers and they go on to do fine. We don't know how long that takes or what the healing process really looks like, and that's really a big question for us. That's one of those sort of data gaps that we don't have.
Interesting, thank you. All right, Blair, a question for you. What considerations are required when you place dolphins into helicopters in terms of altitude and noise?
Well, we fly pretty low. They've flown pretty low, and we always try to cover their ears with some sort of foam, closed cell foam options when you are using a helicopter, and airboats. Actually, you know, we noticed that sometimes we have to use airboats to transport dolphins in and out of certain areas, and we always try to take consideration for their ears and put some closed cell foam by their ears so it doesn't impact them too much. Hope that helps.
Got it, thank you. Another person was wondering, and this is probably for both of you, so Blair, if you could start, what are some potential solutions to lessen the number of strandings?
Well, when it's climate related, that's a much broader question. I think, you know, I'm not quite sure as far as the topics that we discussed, what we can do as, you know, hurricane occurrence and higher hurricane incidence to really control that. I think what we can do is really try to learn as much as we can when animals do strand to see if there are any potential mitigations that we can put into place for different scenarios. But Erin, I'll let you chime in as well on that.
Yeah, I agree. There's not much we can do for these except to be better prepared and as Blair said, learn from each of these events to better understand the impacts of low salinity on dolphins, how that's physiologically impacting them, how they might be able to heal afterwards. There are other situations we didn't talk about, like human interactions and cases where dolphins become entangled or ingest marine debris or gear, and there's certainly things we can do to lessen those impacts. Which would really help dolphin stocks in the Gulf. But with the topics that we discussed today, I agree with Blair. There's not much that we individually can do.
Thank you. Yeah, simple question, complex answer. Appreciate it. All right. Another question. Let's see here. Oops, it just shifted. Were there any tissue samples or biopsies collected for histopathological analysis or anthropogenic chemical analyses? That was from attendee from the US EPA.
Do you want to take that one, Blair, for the UME, or do you want me to take that one?
You can take it. You can take it.
I'm trying to remember. We do typically take a number of tissue samples when there's an unusual mortality event investigation, and we work with the working group to identify what the sort of target samples are. I honestly can't remember what we did for contaminants. I know it was a discussion and there was concern that that the increased runoff associated with that event could also contribute to making the animal sick or die. But at the acute impacts that we were seeing on the dolphins and the freshwater lesions really made it that the cause of the UME was the freshwater exposure. And I think that there were some samples, and I don't know if those have been run. With the Texas 1992 event, that freshwater event that contributed to the die-off of animals in Matagorda Bay, that one was also associated with pesticides. So there were samples that were run for that, and there was high pesticides that were sort of associated with contributing to that mortality event. And contaminants are something that we do regularly look at for stranded animals.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that typical when a UME is designated, that's something that we make sure that we do. We collect samples for histology, histopathology, toxicology, kind of to rule in or out all of those etiologies, just to focus in on a potential cause. So that's something we always collect, everything possible. And as we go through the investigation, we can rule in or out potential causes.
Got it. Thank you both. And recognizing the time, one last quick question, and there are plenty more in there. Like I said, everyone, I'll make sure that Erin and Blair get all the rest of the questions and email addresses and such. But one last quick question, hopefully. Is there a Gulf data hub for strandings?
You want to take it, Blair?
You go ahead.
Okay, so all strandings data, so level A data, which is sort of like the who, what, when, where of the stranding, is required by every stranding network partner to be submitted to the National Stranding Database. And what we call level B and C data, which are the sort of more detailed data that are collected, like morphological data or necropsy data, histopath results, those kinds of things, are also collected by a lot of our partners in the Gulf that are funded through like Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund dollars, or region-wide or state TIG dollars from Deepwater Horizon to collect those sort of additional samples. And those are housed in what we call our Gulf Map database, which is not a public database, but is collected for management purposes. And then there were some recent changes to the Marine Mammal Protection Act just passed over the summer, maybe a little bit earlier by Congress, that will require those level B and C data to be public, similar to the way that the level A data are public. And they're working, I think we have like a year to implement that. So they're working on how that sort of transition will occur. But there are lots of different databases and even more publicly available detailed databases sort of on the horizon that will be out there.
Great, thank you. All right, with that, we'll finish it up. Thank you everyone for joining in and attending today. Erin and Blair, thank you again so much for presenting. This was really fascinating, and lots of great questions. And again, I'll make sure that you get those afterwards as well, and the contacts as well for the people who are asking if you want to follow up. And thank you again, everyone. Our next scheduled webinar will be on December 7th at the same time. And in that presentation, we'll be hearing about mesophotic and deep benthic communities in the Gulf of Mexico. So the mid part of the ocean and the really deep part of the ocean in the Gulf. So I hope you all are able to join in for that as well. Thank you again, everyone. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.